There are many cards that have seen the light of modern play throughout history that just don't see that level of play anymore. I mean, Tarmogoyf is still played in many ways, but Fatal Push has taken it down. I even recently talked about Blightning as a card that templated into Kroxa. But for many of these cards, they do wax and wane in playability. And there's one such spell that I think many blue players are sleeping on. There are other counter spells, other interaction pieces that also exist in the format right now that are overshadowing it, but I'm here to bring the case as to the single best counter spell that could exist in the modern format right now you should be probably playing as a blue player. Now, no, it's not consigned to memory. That one is a sideboard staple. Many blue decks are playing it as a 3 to 4 of because yes, it counters the One Ring, the most ubiquitous card in the format right now, but it also stops a lot of the Eldrazi menace as well. There's a lot of options to a card like that, and again, when you need it, it's a great sideboard option, and the ability to just hit a triggered spell also really comes in handy as well. Just being able to counter your own like Flage triggers and all that stuff. There's a lot of niche options with it. But when it comes to a card like Spell Pierce, which has more ubiquity, I'm not even talking about that as well. Spell Pierce has been mainboarded for a very long time. Out with the Izzet Murktide decks of old, they played Spell Pierce to beat out the removal on their Ragavans and their Dragon's Rage channelers. And so with something like Spell Pierce, you got away with so much in terms of tempo. And that was the key thing with Izzet Murktide, now evolved into the Frogtide decks that we see. This type of strategy really wants to leverage cheap interactive counter magic, and playing against it, I've really gotten to realize recently the power of one such spell. A spell that I've seen played throughout Modern's history to very limited success, I should say. It's been one that's been countering my Glimpse the Unthinkable since I could remember, but a card like Spell Snare is what I would argue one of the best counter magic, one of the best interaction spells that could exist in your main board today. And Spell Pierce is one that has existed, of course, for many blue decks all throughout. Jeskai will play it, Mill has played it every so often, and whatever deck that can play blue from an interactive kind of spell perspective will run it. But I should argue that even outside of the Snapcaster Mage decks, Spell Snare might just have a home for everybody. And that's where I want to go into the top of the metagame here. So if you look at even a deck at the top, like the energy decks, like look at Boros Energy specifically, Spell Snare hits some very key cards in it. I'm looking at cards like Ajani and Amped Raptor, two of its very major threats off the rip that just do so much in terms of advancing its game plan. Ajani creating that long game and creating a big board as well. And then heck, it even hits the Goblin Bombardments as well once they start sacking things and pinging you past your board that you've created full of blockers that just don't matter anymore. But that's just at the top of the metagame. It's just not about the bigger players. What about the Frogtide deck that I was talking about? I mean, the namesake card, Psychic Frog, gets countered by Spell Snare. And heck, even the big bad second menace from the One Ring, Orcish Bowmasters, defining what it means to be a card draw or anti-card draw, I should say, in the format. The card that is probably single-handedly stepping down affinity in the modern format, Orcish Bowmasters, gets countered by Spell Snare. Again, a whole lot of value. And so with that, we can look at, heck, even some stranger brews out there, right? It's not that common to hop into a league and see a deck like Ruby Storm out there. It tends to be more so in the competitive environments, but maybe it's just my experience. I don't see a lot of Storm in the leagues. So that way, I just kind of consider it a brew. It's a deck list that a lot of people have options for, but you really only see it in the competitive scene. But even in that list, it stops so many rituals. It stops Manamorphose, it stops the desperate rituals. But folks, it also stops the enablers. Like, it stops the Ral, it stops the Ruby Medallion. This is single-handedly 1 mana counter 90% of Ruby Storm. How much more do I need to convince you of this? Look at Domain Zoo. For some reason, it's at the top of the metagame right now, but even in there, it stops stuff like the kind of territorial Kavu, it stops Orcish Bowmasters in it, and it stops the namesake card in the deck, Tribal Flames. Tribal Flames gets countered by Spell Snare. 2 CMC, very simple. And I can agree that the lack of flexibility in this card is going to be a big thing that holds it back. But I think as like a 1 or maybe a 2 of, it has to be a fantastic option, right? Like if you're playing Force of Negation, it's a pitch target. So why not just get it out of your hand if you don't have a use for it? But what I want to highlight, even with Eldrazi, is that you always have hits for this across so many archetypes. Take a look at the fact that you can just hit stuff like the Malevolent Rumbles, you can hit their medallions. Like once you're past that point, yeah, you can just pitch it to Force of Negation, Negation, but again, there's so many options for you to hit in every single meta deck that I believe that Spell Snare has to be one of the single best counter spells in Modern right now. But as I was mentioning, if you're not playing Force Negation, what else do you do with it? Well, there has to be pitch targets to it, right? And so Force Negation is that kind of like first level thought. You also have Subtlety as an ability to like pitch another blue card to get it out of the way. So you want to be making sure that you're taking advantage of synergies like this. But also Snapcaster Mage is one of the key things that you want to use as well, because if you do happen to like discard it for some reason or just like get it milled over or whatever happens, you get it thought seized and Inquisitioned away. You want to make sure that Snapcaster Mage also exists in your deck as a way of optionality, which is why you tend to mostly see Spell Snare, in my experience, in the is it kind of mid-range control list. Jeskai control will also play, but again, what I'm trying to argue is that even outside of these cards, if you're playing some key pieces outside of Snapcaster Mage, Spell Snare has a lot of value. And look, don't get me wrong, along with all the counter magic that you're already playing, playing your Drownal Locks, you're playing your Veil of Summers as anti-counter magic, you're playing your counter spell, your Force Negation, you're doing all the stuff that you should be doing. Spell Snare has to be a part of that package. And there is value in the other counter spells. It just needs to be understood as to where you need to put it into your 75. Because something like Consign to Memory, 3 to 4 of in your sideboard, something like Spell Pierce is probably going to be like a 2 to 3 of in your main board as a tempo option. But something like Spell Snare provides something that even something like Mystical Dispute doesn't do that well. Like Mystical Dispute was great in metagames where something like Murktide is at the top. And you could argue right now with Frog being so good that if the One Ring was to be banned, and we saw even a ban out of the energy decks coming in December, that Frogtide would just be the top of the metagame, especially with something like Orcish Bowmasters. Like, I have to point out to people that like Spell Snare stops Orcish Bowmasters, but Orcish Bowmasters still, as I hinted at, single-handedly puts away so many strategies, abilities to even come back into the game, right? Once we don't have the One Ring, what is left? Affinity can't really come back. A lot of decks rely on the One Ring to be able to mid-range out of the game, so energy is completely out of the picture. Is it just going to be Psychic Frog along with Orcish Bowmasters to stop you at the top? Well, in that case, Spell Snare's stock just skyrocket. You gotta have a couple copies of this in your 75 as a blue player if you want to be able to compete. Now, of course, if you can ignore some of these effects, if you can overcome some of these effects, then none of this matters. All I'm trying to say is, as a blue player, this is probably a really good option. And you know what? A lot of times you're trying to attack a niche, right? Like, I'm not saying the Merfolk players should be playing this. They have better interaction. And I'm not saying necessarily that Mill should as well, because Mill really cares about stopping specific things that stops it. So in many ways, it wants to play like the Veil of Summer type of counter spells because it wants to stop the opponent from stopping that. But if you're being reactive, if you're playing the control game, Spell Snare has to be a part of your arsenal in Modern right now. For all the options that I listed right there, you can pitch it away if you don't need it, and then it could just be that second option for any type of strategy out there. There's always going to be something at 2, again, generally speaking, that you can stop. Even against the Merfolk decks that play the Cavern of Souls, that play the Aether Vial to get their stuff out. In that random world where you're still playing Ensnaring Bridge in Modern, you could just cast it, get it out of your hand. Yes, it won't counter it because you got the Cavern of Souls, but at least you got a spell out of your hand. Options are key in this Modern format in this day and age. So let me know what you think about Spell Snare. Are you already playing it? Have you gotten got by Spell Snare? I mean, me as a mill player, here and there, because if I'm playing Glimpse, I'm going to get got. Otherwise, I'm playing Tasha's and Fractured Sandy, so I'm not going to get got there, but it does stop my Drownal Locks. So again, there's things that I get hit by as well. Spell Snare is the card that you can almost never play around. It's kind of like Dispel, where, like counter target instant spell. Like, it's a card that you can almost never play around unless you're in Pauper, where it's very popular. Something like Spell Snare just feels like something that no one talks about because it's like absolutely insane in the format right now.